Hey everyone, and welcome to my guide on pitch shifting, time stretching, and BPM sync on the Roland SP-404 Mark II. Now these are all really important functions to be able to do on a sampler because we want to be able to grab a bunch of different samples from different places that are going to be at different tempos and in different keys and be able to manipulate them to sound good together. The Mark II version of the 404 is really pretty good at the pitch shifting and time stretching. There's some cases in which the time stretching doesn't sound amazing, but I'll show you some workarounds to be able to fix that. So I've got some samples loaded up here, and to be able to change the pitch and speed on them, I'm going to use this pitch/speed button, which will open this menu. Now the 404 has some different algorithms for changing the pitch and the speed, and you'll see the first one that it pulls up is vinyl mode. And that just means when we change the pitch, it will also change the speed, and vice versa. When we change the speed, it will also change the pitch. And that's similar to a vinyl record, whereas if you speed up a vinyl record, the pitch will go up. It'll sound kind of like Alvin and the Chipmunks or something like that. Or if you slow down the record, it will sound lower. So you can see if we change the pitch, the speed is also changing. Speed's going up with the pitch. If we move the pitch down, the speed will go down. And same thing with if we change the speed knob. We speed it up, the pitch will go up. And if we turn it down, the pitch will go down. And you can see when I use the pitch knob, it's changing in complete half steps. Whereas if I use the speed knob, it's just changing full percentage values. Now this menu not only has the speed and the pitch, but it also has the volume of the sample, as well as if we hold shift, we can change the panning of the sample as well. Some of the other pitch and speed changing algorithms can sound a little jittery or stuttery at times. So this one's a great one if we're using a full sample like this that we want to chop up, and we want to make sure it sounds really nice and smooth. So let's go ahead and try doing that. I think that's a pretty even, smooth sound that can be chopped up and made into a nice little beat. The other place this can work well is on a full drum sample if we need to change the speed of it a little bit or something like that, and we don't care if it gets pitched up or down a little bit. So I've got a drum sample here. Let's try that out. There's some noise in that sample. You can hear the noise getting pitched up or down, but I actually don't really mind it. In the right context, that can sound really good. So this is a good algorithm to use when we need to stretch the drum sample to fit. And I'll show you later how to do that with the BPM sync. We'll probably use the vinyl mode to get that done. Then another good example of where the vinyl mode works well is on a single note, something like this bass note here. I can just change the pitch. And I don't really care if that note's getting longer or shorter, really. It still works perfectly fine. And if you need multiple bass notes, you can copy the bass note over to multiple pads and change the pitch on each one. You can also use this chromatic mode here. If you hit Shift 4, you can get different notes from the same pad. And then you can also hit the Enter knob here to change the scale. So right now it's chromatic. You can go over to a minor mode, Dorian. So it's got some different options there. So you don't actually need to make multiple pads out of this one bass note in order to be able to play a bass line. And also while you're on this pitch and speed menu, if you want to change any of these options for an entire bank, you can hold Remain and then change, the volume or the pitch or anything like that. And it'll change for the entire bank. You can see when you hit Remain, it says to bank. So that's why it's going to the entire bank. You can also hit Copy and it will do the same thing, but to the mute group instead of the bank. Now, before I get into the other algorithms for pitch shifting and time stretching, let's go ahead and chop up this main sample and get a pattern going. And that way I can show you more practical examples of how to pitch shift and time stretch to layer into a pattern that we already have going. Let's chop this. You can hear some kind of clicking and popping, so if you hit resample, that'll turn on zero crossing. There's still a little bit of clicking and popping, so we can use envelope afterwards. I'll show you how to do that. Those sound good. I'm going to go ahead and assign them to pads. And then if we go into the envelope menu, then we can hold remain, which will change the envelope for the entire bank. And we're just going to do one attack and one release. That should get rid of all those little clicks and pops in between the samples. I'm also going to turn off gate for all the samples. And then I also want to put them all in a mute group too, so they don't overlap each other. Cool. So let's go ahead and get those into a pattern. Normally I'd maybe spend a little bit more time being creative and trying to find an interesting pattern for them, but right now I'm just going to play them in order just to get a pattern going. Cool, so now would be a good time to show how BPM sync works. So I have a pattern and it's at 84 beats per minute. Now the tempo is defined two different ways. It can be defined by bank or by project. And the way we can see that is through this tap tempo. So if we hit Shift 11, we can see that we have a bank tempo and a project tempo. And whichever one you select with this knob, that's the one that's going to be the default for the entire project. So if it's on project, that's going to be the tempo for the entire project for every pattern. So if we select bank, that'll be the tempo just for this one, the pattern on this one bank. This bank tempo is useful if we want different patterns at different tempos. So we might have bank A have some slower patterns on it, and then bank B has some faster patterns. This will keep the tempos different on the different banks. Right now, I'll just put it on project since I don't need different tempos right now. And we'll go back to 84. The other way you can set here is use this subpad to tap. So we can tap in a tempo. But I know I want 84, so I'll just put it back to 84. So now that we have a defined tempo for our pattern, let's check out BPM sync. So if we're going back over to our drum sample, and we want to automatically sync this to the right tempo of the pattern, we first need to set the correct tempo of this sample. So you'll notice if we just load it up as it was default, it just automatically sets the BPM to 90 there. Now, chances are this is not 90, so we need to change that BPM so it can BPM sync properly. Now, if you've grabbed a sample from a good source like Splice or TrackLab or something like that, chances are it's going to say the tempo in the sample name, and we can see the sample name if we hit remain. You can see a 75 in that sample name, which means that's the BPM of the sample most likely. So if we go back to this pitch and speed menu, we can change the BPM manually here. You can see if we scroll, we have an auto, we have manual, and then manual F. Manual F is just fine pitching. It allows you to get down to 2 decimal points as opposed to just 1. But we're just going to 75. So we'll set it manually, and we'll click the enter button down, and we're just going to scroll till we get to 75. Now this doesn't actually change the tempo of the sample. This is just setting the tempo of the sample so the 404 knows when we start changing the tempo, specifically when we use BPM sync, it will know how to change the speed of the sample. So now that that's set, we should be able to just hit BPM sync and it should automatically jump to 84. Yep, there we go. And because it's on vinyl mode, it also changed the pitch, which I think for drums, that usually works out pretty fine if we're not going too far up or down. And it probably works well here. So let's go ahead and record that into the pattern. And we'll see how that sounds. So that sounds really great just like that. But let's say, for example, if that sounded a little bit off in terms of the pitch. So let's say we wanted to keep that BPM sync at 84, but we want to change the pitch. So that means we need to get out of vinyl mode. So the way we can do that is in the pitch speed menu, if we hold shift and then we turn this knob, we can see it says yes there next to vinyl. So if we turn, now it says no, and you can see now we can change the pitch without changing the speed because we're BPM synced. we turn off BPM sync, we could also change the speed as well. But going back into the shift menu here, we can see that vinyl's set to no, and there's this vary option below it. And if we scroll over, we have off, backing, and ensemble. And these are just the different algorithms for the pitch shifting and the time stretching. So according to the manual, backing is good for things with a fast attack like drums or anything that kind of hits kind of fast and hard. And then ensemble is good for things with longer notes like voice or strings, stuff like that. So we'll go ahead and set it to backing for this drum sample. But I often find that drums are the easiest to mess with, and you can kind of set it to whatever you want and it'll usually sound pretty good. And just as a side note, you can always just change this and experiment and see what sounds best. You don't have to do exactly what the manual says you're supposed to do. So let's have it on backing and we'll go ahead and play the pattern and then we'll start pitch shifting and see how it sounds. I think somewhere around there sounds pretty good. If we wanted to get a little more minute, we could hold shift and get in between the semitones. But I'm not that picky with drums. I think somewhere around there is going to sound pretty good. There is also an automatic BPM set on the 404 Mark II. If we scroll over from manual, we can see auto. And then if we click in, we can set the approximate BPM range and it will try to guess based on the transients where the tempo is on the sample. You can see there's some significant overlap in these ranges, so you can try some different ones. It also has this SX mode where it will simply just take the length of the sample and it'll chop it up evenly based on what it thinks the tempo is. We can go ahead and try one of these. I'm guessing it's not going to land on exactly 75 BPM, but we'll give it a shot. We'll see what happens. It got pretty close. Like that's pretty good. In most cases, that might actually work. But in my case, I know what it is. It's 75, so I'm just going to go ahead and change it back to 75. So now let's go ahead and layer in a vocal sample over our pattern. Now, this is typically one of the trickier things to do in terms of pitch and speed because chances are we're going to need a very specific pitch so the vocal sample lines up. And then we're also going to need a specific tempo too, so it lines up over the course of time as well. So we'll have to go through some of the different algorithms here to see what sounds good. If none of them sound good, we can figure out an alternate solution, but let's go ahead and start and see what happens. So here's my vocal sample. You know I need your pain. And the first thing I'm going to do is try to get it into the right key from the original chopped sample. There's different ways to do this. You can figure out the original key. You can look at the sample name, see if there's a key name in it. I'm just going to use my ear and try to figure out where it'll fit nicely. You know I need you. You know I need your pain. 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 Cool, that sounds right to me. So now that I've got the right pitch here, let's go ahead and see if we can set the correct original tempo to the sample. So let's see if the tempo's in the sample name, and it is 110. So that's good. So we can set that. Go to manual, and we'll turn this up to 110. And you'll notice it's able to hold the pitch and speed change, regardless of me setting the original tempo, which is nice. Let's go ahead and 110. So now we have the original tempo of the sample set at 110, and up +6, it's at 155. So that's not going to work. We're going to need to change to a different pitch shifting and time stretching algorithm. So let's go ahead and change to ensemble since the manual says that's what should sound good for a vocal sample. And then let's change the pitch back up to +6. And then if we use BPM sync, it'll go to 84. This is not really going to be what we want. We probably want to go double that. We'll probably want to go up to, what would it be? 168. But let's hear what it sounds like at 84. Yeah, that sounds awful. So let's see if we can change the BPM up to 184. And no, we can't. So because we can't get any faster than 150% on a sample, Let's go ahead and resample this over to a new pad, and then we can speed it up from there. So let's change this back to vinyl mode to make sure it sounds nice and smooth. And we'll go to our 6 half steps up. And then we'll hit resample, new pad, and let that resample over. And then we know the new tempo from the original sample was 155.56. Let's go ahead and dial that in exactly on our new, our newly resampled sample here. 155.5. So now let's change this over to ensemble mode again. And if we BPM sync, it's going to dip us way back down. So instead, let's manually dial this up to 168. Nice. That sounds good. Let's hear what that sounds like over the sample. Or, sorry, over the pattern. That sounds really good. So that's at the right pitch and the right tempo. That resampling technique is something you kind of get used to on the 404. It's not only a way to get around the limitations like that 150% speed limitation, but also you just end up resampling to apply effects to individual samples as well. I was actually expecting that vocal sample wasn't going to work out and wasn't going to sound amazing. The workaround was actually just going to be to take the sample and put it into Logic and time stretch it there. Because often with these vocal samples, I'll show you an example of some more extreme time stretching where it can start to sound pretty jittery and stuttery. So if we take this sample and we go off of vinyl mode, we go into ensemble, and then let's time stretch it down so it we'll stretch it out, and you'll hear how it starts to sound pretty awful pretty quick. That sound is unusable to me. Like if you're wearing headphones or you have good speakers, you can hear that really clearly. Even through a phone, you can probably hear how bad that sounds. And in some contexts, that might work and that might be perfectly fine. But for my purposes, usually that type of sound is just a deal breaker. It doesn't really work. It's too distracting. It sounds too bad. So the workaround typically for me in this case is just to take that sample and put it into Logic and do time stretching there. The time stretching in a DAW is a lot more advanced than it is in the 404. That's not to say that it's bad in the 404. It's just that DAWs are just so good that they can do these complex time stretching algorithms at a much higher level. So when needed, I will just use Logic and then I'll re-record the sample back into the 404 and use it from there. But even that, in some cases, even Logic or a DAW can't really time stretch enough in a way that still sounds really good. And that's just part of sampling. Sometimes you have to take a sample and you just say, okay, this sample's not going to work here. I just need to go ahead and find a different sample. So that's also a common thing that pops up with trying to fit samples into a pattern like this or something like this. So I think that was everything relating to pitch and speed on the SP-404 Mark II. If I missed anything, please put it down in the comments. And I hope you enjoyed the video. I'll catch you next time.